is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everyone, how's it going tonight? Welcome to tonight's webinar. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. So this is actually the first word that's been in first aid for 28 years. And the idea is that you want to kind of be deliberate and intentional about how you prepare for the boards. If you start, with the end in mind, and you also start early enough, almost all of you will be able to, get everything you need together in terms of preparing for the boards. So again, it's the idea of just keeping the long view in mind and looking at this as a marathon as opposed to a sprint. So what are we going to do in the next 40 minutes? Well, we're going to cover a lot of information, and we're going to cover things like the basics, defining your studies, timelines for timelines, how you approach each subjects, some advice about choosing prep resources, some general advice where I'll get Bryan and Richard to chime in about their experience. We will have a raffle. We're going to raffle a couple RX 360 subscriptions at the end of this. If you wait about 45 minutes into this, you'll get a chance to participate in a raffle. We'll talk a little bit about how to maximize USMLE-Rx. Many of you guys do use USMLE-Rx. We thank you for trusting us. And so we're going to tell you how to get the most out of it. And then we'll have time for open Q&A at the end, where you can essentially try to ask me anything, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. We may go a little over. It's 10 o'clock Eastern time, 7 o'clock Pacific time, but we'll try to do the best we can to answer as many questions as we can. All righty. Great. So let's go to our first poll question. So, I want to learn a little more about who you guys are and where you're from. So I'm going to launch a poll, and I want you to answer what kind of student you are. So I can already see some students answering in. Also, be great if you guys type in where you're from. I'll shout out the countries or state or schools, for whoever shouts it out. Barbados, Peru, Dominican Republic, Mississippi, Jamaica, Texas, Pakistan, Alabama, Netherlands. That's really later. The Jamaica, okay, Ecuador, Colombia. Wow, Richardson, Texas. You guys are too fast for me. India, Haiti, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Ross, California. I know you Ross guys are probably hanging out in Knoxville. SGU, Syria, New York City. Is anybody from Kentucky here? Just kidding. Or AUC. So you guys are all over the place. I think let's see. Most people have responded. I'm going to share Jamaica. God. So as you can see, the majority of you guys are actually from outside the United States. Looks like tonight, almost. Yeah. 45% foreign-born IMGs, 30%. U.S. Who are international, or North American who are national, 20%. U.S. A couple of allopathic students. So fantastic. Yeah, it looks like a great spread of people from all over the place. Cuba, Chicago, Georgia, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Egypt. So yeah, fantastic. So welcome everyone to tonight's talk. Gambia, dang. So good stuff. All right, so we are going to now, move on. So let me close the poll here. I do actually have another poll, which is, when do you plan to take your USMLE Step 1? So is it very soon or later next year? So I'll give you guys a couple seconds to answer that in the poll. Okay, looks like most people have answered. I will close the poll, and it's a big spread. Let's see, am I sharing it? Hold on. Okay, you should see it. Okay, so it's a big spread here, right? So you can see that there's a big spread, all the way through the summer, fall. So that's great. I think, and it's good to see that a number of people are still are looking ahead and so forth. And I suspect that some people are going to be doing it soon, And so we'll try to give you some last minute tips as well too. Okay, great. Let's get back to the presentation. So, all right. So with this big international crowd, what are we going to talk about? So really quick, the basics. This is a one-day exam, okay? 8 hours, as you can see here, 208 questions max in 7 one-hour blocks, 40 questions per block, and you're going to have a minimum of 45-minute break time. You can actually get more, and I'll explain how in just a second. First of all, you can see here, these yellow blocks represent the 7 blocks that you will see, and then you're going to have a block at the very beginning that is for orientation. It's a 15-minute block, but it basically just walks you through the same orientation software that you can get if you just go to USMLE.org and download that orientation program. If you've done it before, then you can pretty much skip this. The only reason what you need to do the only thing that you need to do here is use it to set the audio level on your headset for the handful of multimedia questions they have. And then otherwise you skip it, and then if you do that, you'll capture close to 15 minutes or so. You should really start with a minimum of 60 minutes of break time. Now, as I mentioned, you have 1 hour for each of these blocks. And the other thing to understand is that if you finish one of those blocks early, so in other words, you finish before the 60-minute timer runs out, whatever time is left over, you can also be added to your break time as well too, right? Because you got that 8 hours total, for the entire day. They won't take that away. All right. So what type of questions do you see on the boards? So these days, it's really the one best answer items, right? So it'll be a multiple choice question. You'll have 4 to 8 choices to choose from. And as I mentioned, a couple of them will have multimedia, and most of them are going to be case-based. And what they tend to do is they tend to integrate multiple concepts into one question. So drawing from various basic science disciplines. So this is a typical example of a 2-step question. So a 32-year-old Caucasian woman presents to your clinic with a 5-day history of occasional bilateral double vision and ptosis. And then it asks, what is the most appropriate diagnostic test? The first thing you'll notice, of course, is that it's not actually asking you for what the actual diagnosis is. It's actually asking you for what the diagnostic test would be to make that diagnosis. So to break down this question, step 1, you need to figure out, based on the clinical clues that they provided, what is the most likely diagnosis. And in this particular case, Caucasian woman, fairly young, she's got the double vision, bilateral with the ptosis. The most likely thing here is going to go on diagnosis will be myasthenia gravis. You could argue for multiple sclerosis, but typically that tends to have unilateral findings. So again, if your clinical index of suspicion is telling you this is myasthenia gravis, then what is the most appropriate diagnostic test, which is the actual second step of the question. And so in this case, the answer is going to be the tensilon test, or short-acting or idrophonium, which is a short-acting acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. All righty. So that's an example of a 2-step question. Now on the boards, the majority of the questions will be either 2-step questions, 1-step questions. They will have a handful of 3-step questions. We'll talk about how we handle that in QMX. Don't worry, we've got plenty of 2-step and 3-step questions that'll cover you for some of these complexities on the boards. Okay. Next thing we're going to talk about is the actual interface itself. What are you going to see when you walk into that Prometric test center? All right. So you're going to see pretty much a straightforward interface. You've probably seen already if you've been using our QBank, or you've used the USMLE-Rx. You've gone to the USMLE.org website and gotten their software. This is a PC-based software. As you can see here in the middle, they've got the question. This is called the STEM. The STEM is the case, and then the actual question itself, in this case about diagnosis, is the lead-in. And you can see in this particular case, you can have you see you got 5 choices. Sometimes it'll be 4, sometimes it'll be 6 or more, and about 15 to 15 to 20% of the time, you're going to get some sort of visual information, a diagram, some gross pathology, micro, so forth. You'll notice you'll have navigation tools across the top and across the side as well too. Keep an eye on your timer. That's going to be critical. You've got a timer for how much time you have left in the block, and then you have a timer for what you got left in the day. The key thing here, and then of course you got the exit, and you can lock it. When you lock this, by the way, the timer still runs, even if you're locking the test just to go use the bathroom. Okay. The other trick to know here is that while you are before you exit the block, while you're in here, you can change any answer you want. However, as soon as you click that exit, you cannot change any answers in that block, even if you still have other blocks to go. So just keep that in mind. All right, the other thing to just be aware of, they do have accessibility features, so you can reverse out the screen if you cannot handle a light screen, a bright screen, and also you can also magnify the text and the images as well. All right, so let's talk about passing and scoring, because that's what all of you guys are really focused on. So in the last year, they raised the passing to 194, used to be 192, now it's 194 on a 3-digit scale. They won't say what the theoretical maximum is, but it's approximately around 300. The mean is 229, and that's been holding steady for the last couple of years. It had been creeping up, but it's been holding steady. Standard deviations is around 20 points, and I'll show you a percentile curve percentile graph in just a little bit. If you are a U.S. medical student, you will, in all likelihood, pass the exam. If you're an osteopathic medical student, essentially the same. If you're an IMG, whether you are a U.S. IMG, so you're born in North America but went internationally, or you were born internationally and you went to school internationally, the passing rate's a little lower, but you still get, but IMG still will pass, in the 90s, in the experience that we've seen, talking to IMGs. All right, so in fact, here's the percentile curve, and I'm sorry, yeah, they did confirm a couple of years ago that the max score is 300, but they had toyed with that for many years. And so what you'll see is that, as you can see here, this is roughly, you're looking at the USMLE Step 1 curve here, roughly to be at the median, you got to be around 230-ish there. And then 99th percentile flattens out really at 265. And then for the proverbial 250, you need to be about 1 standard deviation above the mean. So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. All right, so we talk about defining your goals, passing the exam, beat the mean, ace the exam, so again, these are all reasonable goals. But when you think about it, one of the reasons why you need to perhaps think about acing the exam is if you're considering a very competitive specialty like these. And the mnemonic here is the road to riches. So radiology, radiation oncology, the O stands for essentially the surgical subspecialties like orthopedics, ophthalmology, otolaryngology, urology, plastics, which we call aesthetics, and then dermatology. So the unfortunate reality, and while I don't agree with it, this is what they're talking about. Training programs will use the USMLE Step 1 score as a screening tool because they're often overwhelmed with applications. So while the USMLE was not designed for that, for better or worse, that's actually how it's being used. So you just need to be aware of that. This is some data to kind of corroborate that. This is actually an old table, so the numbers are no longer up to date. But the reason why I show it because it actually, what they did was they put the numbers in the order of the specialty where they were the highest. So this happens to be talking about U.S. seniors that match, but it really applies to just about everyone. So these are allopathic students here. And what you'll notice is that these again are the road specialties right here. These days, these numbers are if you look at the NRP charting outcomes in the Match publication, the latest versions of those, for these specialties, yeah, you pretty much need to be in the mid 240s, the high to 250 to make sure that you don't get screened out if you're looking for, if you're looking to get into one of these specialties. Otherwise, if you want to do other specialties like internal medicine, which is what I did, my wife did pediatrics, Richard did family medicine, as long as you're in the big middle, you're fine. The only exception would be is if you're applying to a very competitive program in that field. So if you're doing internal medicine, you want to go to Duke University, or you want to go to the Brigham or UCSF, you're still going to want to score well above average so to avoid being screened out. All right, now before you guys get too agitated, I do want to point out some other things. So if you notice on this graph, what they did here is they plotted the median probability of matching to your preferred specialty over the deciles. Okay, so these are the decile scores. And so the story is that even if you been in a situation where you failed, if you're a North American medical student, essentially allopathic, or I think essentially even osteopathic, you're probably matching into a preferred specialty still going to be pretty high. If you are an IMG, which is a lot of the folks that are on this call tonight, you'll notice that there is a flatter response curve there. If you are a North American medical student, again, going to a North American medical school, if you're going to something very competitive like ENT, which is what my brother did, then you're going to have a steeper dose response curve. So that's what you got to keep in mind. But that being said, even if you had an average score, you still have a pretty high chance of getting into one of those competitive specialties. So just you keep that in mind. All right, so I threw a lot of stats at you. So now I want to ask another question, which is, what is your step one goal? Is it to pass comfortably, which is perfectly fine, or is it to beat the average, or is it to ace the exam? So I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to key in an answer, and then I am going to share it with the group. All right, so we are going to close the poll because I think everybody has answered, and I am going to share it. And we have a very, very ambitious crowd tonight. 65% of you guys want to ace the exam, and then the rest are perfectly fine just being the average or passing comfortably, which, by the way, like I said, they are all great answers. At my medical school, which was fairly competitive, we had quite a few classmates that were very happy just passing the exam, and they did perfectly well. All right, so let's talk about timelines for study. First, I got to get rid of that graph so I don't block anybody here. So now we're going to get the timelines for study here. So we talk about this in first aid, and we try to keep things really simple. So there's the just pass schedule, and I think, as you can tell, I'm overgeneralizing. There's the just pass schedule. There is where it's really 1 or 2 months of dedicated study time, maybe mixed in with your finals or right before your finals, where you use first aid as a framework for preparing. You do focus on crammable subject, but you're very selective, and you're going to do review questions in 2 question banks, and I'll explain why 2 question banks as opposed to just 1 question bank. One is not generally going to be enough. And then if you want to do really well, or if you're the type of person that doesn't do well with standardized exam, then you're going to spend more time. You're going to spend more time that's in your schedule, or you're going to have more dedicated time. And so in addition to the resources of just pass schedule, you're going to be covering obviously almost everything else, including big subject areas like pathology in detail, and you're going to still be doing 2 question banks, but perhaps 3 question banks to get enough practice. Okay. Okay. Let's go on. So let's talk about study styles. So in terms of study strategies, the good news is that almost all of you have done some sort of standardized exam before, whether it's the US or internationally. So whether it's the MCAT or some other entrance exam. So you generally know how to prepare for these types of exams. So beyond that, what else should you be considering? Well, first of all, you should be considering, what you're approaching, right? So pathology often requires a different set of strategies than, say, pharmacology or physiology, right? you also need to think about your curriculum and how well was it taught, and how and while they want you to be a good doctor, did it also help you prepare for the boards, and what areas did it do a good job and what areas did it not? Okay, and then finally, how much time do you have? Sometimes you have a lot of time. Sometimes you're very constrained because your school will only give you a certain amount of time, after finals and before the actual exam, and you may or may not be getting a ton of time during the school year. So you got to think about if you get a lot of time with subject, you'll be able to use different types of study strategies that are integrated, and if not, you're going to have to use a much more focused approach. All right. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes talking about generally high yield areas in the various basic science subject disciplines that show up on the boards. A couple of things. One is this entire talk, again, is on my blog at firstaidteam.com, so you do not have to write all this down or take screenshots all the way through. You're welcome to, but it's not necessary. I'll show you exactly where to get this stuff. Number two, for many students who are at schools that have organ-based curriculum, which is a lot of schools, you can obviously apply all this across organ systems. All right. So again, and when I go through, you'll notice there will be a couple of themes that tends to show up across all these disciplines. The first theme that you'll notice is that they tend to focus on clinically relevant basic science. So it'll be clinically relevant anatomy, so traumatic injuries, procedures, and so forth. So if you're presented with a patient comes to your emergency room with a spiral fracture of the humerus, then they may ask you, hey, what is the what sensory and motor loss will you have in the hand? So you need to think about what goes, what nerve goes through that spiral groove, right, in the humerus. You'll be able to, now you'll see, when we talked about images and illustrations on the boards, it's not going to be like the traditional things, right? It's not going to be like cadavers and stuff like that. It's going to be, clinical imaging like X-rays, CTs, MRIs. You still need to know your anatomy, but you have to apply it clinically, right? So that's the key thing there. All right, biochemistry is crammable. So this is going to be one of the couple of crammable areas, and we'll talk about how to approach crammable type subjects a little bit different and how they differ a little bit from, say, less crammable topics like pathology. Again, with regards to what's clinically relevant, right? Vitamin deficiencies, any genetic disorders, any disorders that affect key regulatory enzymes. So the way I think about it is biochemistry. On the hard science side, like the research side, you need to know about laboratory techniques like RT-PCR, northern blot, southern blot, western blot. What do these all mean, and why would scientists be using this, and what kind of answers can they get from these types of scientific techniques? Micro and immuno is also crammable. The big takeaway here is that it's not all about pure micro like bacteriology, right? So don't forget about virology, immunology, parasitology, and so forth, right? Here's crammable because they tend to repeat, they tend to kind of go after the same types of concepts, which is, for each bug, how can they be classified, how can they be identified, diagnosed, where do they go, where do they go, how do they get there, do they have any reservoirs, do they have any vectors? So those are the types of things that they tend to pick up, all right? On the immunology side, again, keep thinking about how this is clinically relevant, okay? It can be rare, like immunodeficiency, like Brunn's gamma globulinemia, doesn't happen every day, but it clearly shows the immune system at work. All right, pathology, as I mentioned, is this big topic, and almost everybody will, study some pathology because there's just so much high yield stuff that's in there. But a couple of things to think about is that it tends to, on the boards, they tend to, go after hallmark characteristics of the common or of rare diseases, and then they may have some variations if it's something very common like diabetes or asthma. In the patient description, all these things should help if they do provide it, okay? it's possible for a white person to have, somebody like an African American to have cystic fibrosis and stuff like that. So you do need to keep an eye out. Don't let that fool you. But nevertheless, generally these things should work in your favor in terms of helping you, classify what's coming your way. Now, in first aid and other test prep resources, you're going to have all kinds of buzzwords, mnemonics, this, that, and the other, and that's perfectly fine for studying. But remember, on the boards, they're not going to be using those buzzwords like double bubble sign or stuff like that. They're going to actually be describing the physical finding or the motion and you have to figure it out. So great, learn those buzzwords kind of as a memory aid, but know exactly how it gets described. All right. And then, as I mentioned, 15 to 20% of the time you're going to get these images. The key thing here is that the majority of the time you should be able to answer the question even without looking at the images. That's the dirty little secret. So I generally recommend that when you get to a question that has one of these, you ignore the image, you read through the question, try to get the answer first, then look at the image, if you can, because a lot of times you don't really even need it. And same goes with the multimedia, the handful of multimedia that you're going to see on the board. So again, read the STEM first, read the case first, before you actually look at the clinical image or the X-rays. All right, pharmacology, as I mentioned, is also crammable. All right, and again, they tend to focus on because they tend to focus on common concepts like mechanism of action, clinical uses, clinical indications, toxicity, adverse events, drug-drug interactions. When you focus on the drugs and the therapies and how they're applied, you got to focus on the classic drugs and the major variants. At least, if you're time limited, you can go towards more minor drugs or more newer drugs if you've got more time. But in any case, you don't need to learn the trade name unless you're using it as a memory aid or as part of a mnemonic, and you don't need to know the dosages. Okay, physiology, as I mentioned earlier, so it's more concept oriented, so it's more about knowing the relationships. So often mind maps or diagrams are very helpful for studying physiology and linking it to pathology. And again, they're almost always going to be in the form of a clinical vignette. Psychiatry. So this is one of the new sections where we reorganize the subsections. So it is what you expect to be in there. So we include psychology, sociology, and some psychopharmacology. There is a tendency for us to focus on the mood disorders, but there's all kinds of other high yield areas as well too that we do cover in first aid. And so this kind of highlights some of them. So just keep that in mind. Public health. So we made some changes to public health in the last couple of years. While traditionally includes things like biostatistics, epidemiology, ethics, and so forth, in the last couple of years, the board has had more focus on healthcare delivery, patient quality, and quality improvement. So that's definitely covered in first aid. In biostats, as I mentioned, is very high yield, just because it's pretty fixed in what they cover and what they don't. So it's pretty straightforward. Let's go to review resources next. So there are a ton of things you can use out there. There are text reviews like first aid, of course, test banks like USMLE-Rx and UWorld and stuff like that. Self-test reviews, so the question books, case-based reviews, other types of books, lots of review courses out there, all kinds of websites and media and stuff like that. So apps everywhere, including like the USMLE-Rx app and so forth. And so what are you going to do? You've got a couple of limitations, right? You don't have all the money in the world. A lot of you guys are going to graduate with debt of some sort, but even more significant, you don't have time. So a lot of you guys are juggling, full-time classes. Even you're an IMG, you might be holding down a job, or you may be doing other things, or taking care of a family. Even if you're outside of medical school, or you're still working as a doctor, and then coming over and trying to do the exam. So time sometimes is the biggest blocker for you, right? So how do you pick and choose resources? So there's a couple of things to think about. So every year in first aid, we publish a set of resources, resource reviews. In the book, it's section 4, we have the recommended resources and a simple letter grade. We provide no rationale, but if you go to our blog at firstaidteam.com, we actually provide in-depth explanations for why we think this is a great resource or why you should consider it. Okay. Once you know what you want, you might as well just go ahead and get it early, or at least peg out what you're early, and go ahead and use it. For example, you're going to use first aid or Pathology or whatever, go ahead and get it now. That being said, try not to overbuy, right? Because number one, most of these things are available on demand. You can order them from Amazon or whatnot, or you can subscribe to them, on their app or their website. And sometimes some of these things are available at your medical school library, right? Sometimes these things you can get them on library loan, right? So you can save a couple of bucks there. And then lastly, something to think about is that within a series, some resources may be better, some may be worse. So just keep that in mind, when you are looking through a whole series of resources. All right, so I'm going to pause there. I am going to now ask you guys yet another question, which is, what resources will you likely use? In this particular case, choose all that applies. All right, so it could be one of the above or all of the above. So take your time and think about this. I'll give you guys a couple. Well, you guys are answering pretty quick, but I'll give you guys another 5 seconds or so. All right, looks like most of you have answered the question, so I am going to close the poll and share the answer. And what we see is that there's a lot of folks who are going to be using, multimedia type stuff like videos and mobile apps and digital flashcards, but which has been kind of on the rise. But almost everybody's going to be using Q banks, and most people will be using review books as well too, like First Aid or any of the other books that are out there. It's good to see that some of you guys are also using some of the school's resources, because they are useful. So that's fantastic. Okay, so with that, I am going to remove the poll, and then we're going to move on to study tips. And this is where I'm going to get Richard and Bryan to chime in a little bit in a second here. So what I'm going to just share with you is advice that has been given to us by thousands of students and IMGs over the years, and seems to have worked really well. So I'm going to go slightly out of order here. First is when you establish a study schedule, you obviously do your homework, talk to your peers, talk to the third years, talk to your advisor, think about your strengths and weaknesses, what your goals are, and so forth. There are plenty of examples out there and apps that'll help you put your schedule together. But once you put your schedule together, you should try to really stick with it, okay? If you end up switching up your schedule or modifying it a lot, it often creates unneeded anxiety, and it rarely helps you unless you've had an obvious issue. There's a couple of things that you can keep in mind that will allow you to do that. One is, you're less likely to have to change your schedule if you don't overschedule, right? So make sure you schedule time for breaks. I recommend, even in your dedicated time off, in your dedicated study period, that you take a day off a week to either do light stuff or be with friends and family, to do something recreational. You can use part of that day if you want to do some catch up, but otherwise try to give yourself some time to decompress. Also, try not to try to study 14 hours a day, because that is very hard to maintain. We also have a checklist in the front of our book, right after all the acknowledgments, but before, the guide for, the guide for efficient exam preparation. That has a checklist that you should take a look at as well too. So another thing that we like to think about is that you can try to approach the material in a variety of different ways. Certainly, you're going to be using books. Certainly, you're going to be doing questions. So those are different methods. Whether they're case-based or not. Case-based is a good way of doing it as well too. Flashcards is a good way of doing it as well too. But the idea is to use various methods, so it actually helps you, have a better integrated picture and attack the material from different angles. So it becomes more well-grounded in your mind, and you're less likely to forget about it. I mentioned the crammable subjects, right? So biochemistry, things like certain areas in biochemistry, pharmacology, they tend to be, again, high yield because it's more about, information that has a set structure. Whereas physiology, it's tougher to cram that, right? Because it's all about various relationship and what happens, in the Sertoli cells are maybe different than what's going on in the hypothalamus in terms of the various relationships. When studying, you will, in your couple years of medical school, or when you're in medical school, you will have covered all the high yield stuff, or a lot of the high yield stuff in the past. So focus on that stuff. Focus on stuff that you already know about. And then if it's high yield, if we say it's high yield, or other reputable resources say it's high yield, then focus on that as well too. But key in on things that you've already learned, because it's so much easier to learn it again. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, you want to stay relaxed. You want to be very deliberate in how you approach this. Always keep that. Always keep the long view in mind. I'm going to pause there for a second. Want to see if Bryan or Richard want to share any advice that's either similar or different from this. Do you guys have anything to add?
I'm seeing a lot of people ask about, we have a large international audience tonight, asking about experience, years since graduation, things like that. But everyone's here at the Step 1 conference, right? So I'm assuming you still have to take the Step 1. Doing well on the Step 1 is a great way to call attention to your application. All those other details, very, very important, but the standardized exams, they're going to be, you're always measured up against your peers. So if you do well on that, it'll definitely make your application stand out.
Great, thank you, Bryan. Richard, do you have any study tips that's different or similar to what we just discussed here?
Kind of what Bryan was saying, you definitely want to score as high or higher than your peers if you're an international medical graduate. I'm an IMG myself, and definitely during the match, there's a lot of other factors that kind of go into the actual match process, like your graduation and stuff like that, clinical experience. So definitely you want to have the full package. But definitely take your time when studying for the exam. Don't rush it. If you're not ready to take it, if your MBMEs are not kind of where you want to be, don't take the test, don't sit for it. I think, as Tao outlined, there are subjects that you can kind of cram for rather than other things such as like pathology that require a lot more attention. So definitely kind of gauge how good you guys are in a subject before you're gonna, best way is to say, like, we can't tell you how quickly to study for a subject per se, but we can. It just kind of depends on your comfort level of the subject. So that's all I gotta add.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, guys. All right, so we're going to keep on going because I know folks have questions that they want us to answer at the very end. And I appreciate, again, Richard and Bryan furiously keeping up with all your various questions along the way. You guys are certainly keeping us on our toes tonight. All right, so let's talk about the computer-based exam. So that's what CBT stands for, computer-based testing. That's the USMLE's term. A couple of things here to be familiar with first of all, while it is mouse driven, you can actually use the keyboards for certain parts of the exam to key in answers if you want. But the key thing is really do lots and lots of questions, and you want to do it throughout and at the very end. That's certainly something I'm sure you've heard from other folks as well too. But not only that, there's actually great science to support this. So there's been a series of articles, but one of the biggest ones was in the journal Science, 5-6 years ago from the University of Purdue, where basically they found that if you self-test yourself, you did better. So what happened was they had college students study biology material and so forth, and some people did it, they just read it once. Some people read it multiple times. Some people did concept mapping, and other people just basically self-tested themselves. So self-testing be creating your own questions or using external question resources. That all counts the same, right? So it turns out that people who, and the key thing is everybody had the same amount of time. Nobody had any more time than anyone else. But those who actually self-tested themselves did significantly better if it was simpler type questions. And even with more complex inferential questions, they still did 15% better. So the moral of the story is that you can, you almost can't do too many questions. And this is absolutely a preferred way of learning. So it's not just self-testing yourself, but you can actually learn this way, because what you're doing is when you're testing yourself, you're actually strengthening your ability to retrieve knowledge and apply those from long-term memory. Okay, so that's a little bit of the learning science that's going on here. Now let's focus more on USMLE. What is out there in the USMLE research? Well, interestingly enough, there's a couple of studies out there, that have talked about the efficacy of question banks. So it turns out that from Washington University, St. Louis, this group found that question banks, no surprise, were more effective than flashcards, because question banks look, of course, and feel more like the real thing that you'll actually see on test day. In this particular case, they did say that you had to do, in their particular study, they saw you had to do 400 and change questions in a Q bank to earn 1 point on the USMLE Step 1. A recent paper came out from University of Michigan, was presented at the AAMC and published at the AAMC last year in Academic Medicine. They found something similar, but in this particular case, they said, well, really, in their cohort, they saw that you only had to have 300 questions more, or do 300 board questions to get 1 extra point on the boards. But they found something that was really unique that hasn't been reported in the literature before. They found out that that really the power is in doing unique questions and not repeating the questions. So I've noticed some people asking about, hey, should I be going through, I've been screening some of the questions here. Some people say, hey, should I be going through X, Y, and Z Q bank 2 or 3 times? It turns out that repeating the questions actually doesn't help you because you lose the element of surprise. And again, I can show that data in just a little bit. The other thing that they noticed is that, and again, while it gets no surprise, this is the first time they actually proved it, that people that go through first aid 3 or more times do better on the USMLE Step 1 than people who do not. But that being said, you want to do it in a very interactive way. So, we'll tell you a little bit about how to do that. Let me see if I've actually got that. So yeah, here's the paper. So this is the title of the paper, Study Behaviors in USMLE Step 1 Performance. Just remember the last name, Jesse Burke-Raphael, B-U-R-K-R-A-F-A-E-L. If you Google that or you go to PubMed, you'll see it. But if you look at their master model, and this is a regression model, these are the factors that are significant. Unique questions, yes, significant, helps you on the board. First aid, this is first aid, yes, significant, helps you on the board. Repeating questions did not help you on the boards. If you want to do it for studying, fine, but it didn't really actually make a difference. So repeating question bank questions actually, so that's why at a minimum you got to do 2 question banks, perhaps 3 question banks if you want to do externally well, or you're an IMG and you do above average and you might be challenged on the exam. All right, let's continue. There are different types of practice options. good news is not everything costs money. So from the USMLE, you have the sample test. Download at usmle.org. It's helpful for format familiarity. From the NBME, they have the NBME forms. 6 or 7 are available at a time. You can pay 45 to 60 bucks to get access to them. It's roughly 200 questions, and they're good for benchmarking. The only problem is they don't give you the explanations, and so it's not that helpful for remediation. So if you got something wrong and you might not know why you got it wrong. So that's a bit of a bummer. Question banks like USMLE-Rx, World Kaplan, these are good for practice, study, and simulation. They can also help predict your results on the board. For example, USMLE-Rx can predict your scores plus or minus 20 points. So it's helpful for that. And of course, it's good for explanations as well too. All right, so let's talk about some tips for test day, right? So a couple of things to keep in mind, and some of this hopefully will come across as common sense. You're going to want to modulate your stimulation because you're going to be jacked up anyway for the exam. A lot of you are. You got to think about your comfort, and when you're going to the Prometric testing center, a lot of these test centers are cold. They're running the AC like really hard for whatever reason, or the sun will come off the building at a different angle during the day, and so it'll be cold in the morning. It might be hot in the afternoon. The other thing is, as they have been reducing the number of questions that have been on the boards, we've noticed that sometimes the stems are getting a little bigger, so the vignette stories are getting a little more complex and bigger. So if you see a question that has a big fat vignette and it's got a lot of information, sometimes what you should do is read the lead-in, which is the question, the actual question at the very end of the block. Read that first, skim through the choices, then go back and read through the case at the very top, okay? In terms of the clock, remember 60 minutes per block and 40 questions per block. So you do the math, it's going to be 90 seconds per question. So here's the strategy I recommend. When you do a question, try not to spend more than 75 seconds the first time around for that question. So at the end of that 75 seconds, if you cannot get down to a single best answer, take your best guess, check the box to mark it if you think it is solvable, and then go on. But if you go through all 40 questions at 75 seconds or less, you're generally going to have 10 to 15 minutes at the very end to go back to try to solve some of those hard but perhaps solvable questions. Alrighty. You mentioned earlier in the slide when I showed you that diagram, you're going to have time between each of the blocks to take a stretch break, or go for a pee break, or get a light lunch or refreshments. The majority of students will try to spread out their breaks a little bit. You may have a light lunch, or some people will just do a couple blocks snack, whatever, that type of stuff. The best way, one way to kind of figure out what technique works most for you is to try to do a half day or full day simulation. So for example, in USMLE-Rx, when you go in, if you first subscribe to our question bank, you can go in and try to set some questions aside in a full day simulation. It'll give you this whole 7 hours, the whole bit, and then you can use that to find out, when your energy level is the lowest, and therefore that might be a good time to take a break and a light lunch. The other thing that you'll obviously encounter on the boards is that some questions are going to be really hard, potentially unsolvable, at least in the time period that you have. And again, the boards will have some easy questions, and they're going to have some hard questions. And again, if you cannot solve it and you cannot reduce it to some distractors, you just take your best guess and go along. And so we call it the C reflex. So in my study group in med school, we all chose C as the answer. We didn't know what was going on. A couple of things to keep in mind. Some of those questions are experimental questions. They may not be graded as part towards your score. So hopefully sometimes if it's an impossible question, maybe it's one of those experimental questions. So just keep that in mind.